Welcome, Minister Joly, Minister Munoz, and Administrator Power. This panel, Women's Leadership, Advancing Gender Equality and Democracy in the Americas, is here to discuss how gender equality is strengthening democracy and how women's leadership is critical to both democracy and equality. In short, women's leadership is fundamental to democracy. So first, let me introduce the panelists. Minister Joly is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada since 2021 and is the MP for Montreal and is the former Minister of Economic Development, Minister of Tourism, and Minister of Canadian Heritage. Welcome, Minister Joly. Minister Erika Munoz is the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada, in Panama since 2020. Speaking too quickly, probably for the translators as well.
No, but Erika, I don't want to swap, but you're invited to come together.
You should have heard them backstage. They were already creating international cooperation. Minister Munoz previously served as the Minister of Multilateral Affairs and Cooperation in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so very relevant to what we're talking about today. Welcome. Administrator Samantha Powers has assumed the leadership of USAID in May of 2021. She's the first USAID administrator that's a member of the National Security Council, and she served as the ambassador to the United Nations in the Obama administration for 4 years. Welcome, Ambassador Power. So we're ready to start, but before we start, I just want to give you some facts. You've heard a lot of what we talked about before, of the facts and figures. But women's leadership is essential for democracy. We know that with women's leadership, the GDP will grow by over 6%. We know that with women's leadership, there's better control of corruption, but there's better policies that serve entire communities, and especially in health, education, and welfare. We know with women's leadership that countries are less likely to go to war, they're less likely to commit human rights abuses, and peace treaties have a 35% chance of lasting 15 years or more when women are signatories to these. And finally, what is interesting is latest research shows that voters have more confidence in their government when there's more parity in women's leadership in government. So I'm going to start with you, Minister Joly. Canada is at the forefront of women's rights and gender equality. It is the second country in the world to establish a feminist foreign policy. Can you share the impacts of this feminist foreign policy, both domestically and abroad?
Well, thank you, Gwen. Great to see you all. Thank you for attending this fantastic event, and thank you to my two colleagues to be here, for being here. So first and foremost, Marie-Carmen at the beginning mentioned how much the pandemic had an impact on women in particular. And to give you an example of a feminist policy that we've put into place in Canada, it was really the question of childcare. For 30 years, we've been talking about the importance of childcare, but the conversation, apart from my province where I come from, Quebec, was pretty much going nowhere. And bit by bit, in thinking of how we could recover from the pandemic, even the business sector were advocating for women to be able to continue to work because obviously they had a place for their child at an affordable price. And so we in Canada, we're a country that has 10 provinces and 3 territories, and we were able in the last year and a half to do agreements with 10 different provinces, 3 territories, and now in Canada, people have around a 25% discount on their on the price of sending their child to childcare. So that's just an example. Plus, we're committed to increase the number of places that are available. So that's an example, and I think it was done, yes, by our government having a feminist lens, but it was also bringing people along. The other thing is on the feminist foreign policy side, we've been working on many things, including, for example, helping Peru, drafting legislation regarding gender-based violence. We've worked a lot also with Chile because in our free trade agreement, we have a chapter that is directly on women's rights. And in general, also, we've been at the forefront of supporting women's rights and sexual and reproductive rights all across our aid policy. So this is also something that we believe in at home, obviously, but also in the world.
Fantastic. Minister Munoz, I want to move to you. In Panama, you're one of the countries that advanced quotas and gender parity laws to guarantee women's political representation. But you're also one of the first countries to establish a quota for women's participation in the boards of publicly funded and state-funded institutions. I want to hear your thoughts about how that's working, how that can work in the region. Is there an impetus for intergovernmental cooperation around these actions?
Sure, thank you. First, it hasn't been easy to implement the law, and we're still working on the target that we have, but we've making great progress. It is always the case that you see even women advancing, and it gets to a point where at the decision-making level, both in the private and the public sector, there is not that access. In the private sector, we have, and many Latin Americans do, family-run companies that rarely put women on the board. It is the sons that are meant to run the family business, and there is no space for those women, for any women. So I have taken a personal task of actually publicly shaming them and taking those names of those companies that are not fulfilling their quota. And the same goes for the government. We are making progress, but we're not there yet. So, my colleague ministers that also are women are also always supporting. And I think it's very important, maybe because of the quota system, we've had this perception of it's not you, it's me among women. And we ought to celebrate every time a woman takes a position or thrives or is successful, whether it's a political role or in a board or whatever it is. So we make it a point of actually congratulating and making it evident that her success is my success. And it is a way of advancing, I think, that policy. When I deal with foreign governments, and I get often the question whether I feel intimidated, because it is often the case that I sit in a room mostly of men. I saw Minister Jolie today, the only woman again, in a lineup of other leaders. I don't feel intimidated ever. I think that I'm equally qualified, sometimes even more, and I don't know why it is that the assumption that I feel threatened, that I should feel threatened, or that I need to wait till the turn, the exact moment to speak up. So I think that I try to make it a point of making it evident that there should be more women at the table to the other, whoever is sitting. So if it's a president, I'm like, I hope that your next minister is a woman. When I deal with law firms, I always ask, how many women do you have on board, or consultants? And I think that's a way of truly endorsing and making it clear for those that are taking those decisions that it is important to have women in those roles.
It's that part of accountability, but also calling it out and recognizing it, because it's a huge thing and it's important. And we have a panel of all women here, which is so exciting to close this out. And speaking of that representation, Minister of Power, we have parity in the cabinet in the United States, and we have our first ever woman vice president, which is exciting. So talking about your time at USAID and sort of more women in leadership positions and the lines of international cooperation, what are you doing at USAID in order to advance women's leadership and power?
Great. Well, let me just follow up on Erica's comment about accountability. It is the absence of self-awareness is staggering sometimes, because often, in the pandemic, there's a little bit less travel, but we have started to see more and more delegations passing through when one travels and gets to sit down with the head of state and the full cabinet. These are really important meetings, and as USAID, we have missions in 80 countries and programs in 100 countries. And so we get, as do the ministers, great audiences. And often you'll hear back the prioritization given to women's empowerment because I'm USAID and that's such a central part of our agenda, or because I'm a woman, or because I work for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I don't know, but you get it. And then you look across the table and there's 10 ministers ahead of state and not one woman. But so I guess you could say, hypocrisy, or what is the expression again? The tribute that vice pays to virtue, that it's kind of progress to start talking about women's empowerment, but we're not yet at the phase where, you necessarily see people integrating in a very self-aware way. If you were in that situation and all your advisors were men, you'd say, I know we have some work to do, but, this is really part of our agenda. You tend not to hear that disclaimer. There's kind of a little bit of a disconnect. And so I think what Erica described of sort of naming it and saying, we could, there's probably a little work to be done here, I think is important. President Biden, his lifelong top advisor is his sister, Valerie, and she ran every one of his campaigns, basically up until his presidential campaigns. And he just, for him, it wasn't about, necessarily creating this kind of parity and thing. It was just he went forth, chose the best people. I'm flattered that I was among them. I guess I shouldn't say it that way, but I think he also chose the first Native American member of a cabinet, the first openly gay member of his cabinet. And what's wonderful is in creating such a diverse cabinet, I was thinking about it yesterday when all those little kids were up on the stage in the inauguration ceremony and talking with such passion about these countries that they were learning about and all of the remarkable features of this Western Hemisphere and of the Americas. And then I was thinking what a wonderful thing it is that Kamala Harris is up there and what that means, not only for the young girls, but for the boys to see that and for that to be normal and for that to be natural. And then I was thinking, but then they look at the audience of all the heads of state, and I'm like, well, maybe the lights are such that they could just see Kamala. But I think representation really matters. And when I was ambassador at the Security Council, I had it both ways. At one point, we were 6 female ambassadors of the 15, and 6 isn't half, as the population of the planet would warrant, but nonetheless, it was progress. But for more than a year, maybe a year and a half, I was the only one, like you often are. And what I would so often think about again is the tours that come through the United Nations and are up in the balcony, and they come down and they see the famous horseshoe, where things are supposed to get done and sometimes don't get done. But there at the horseshoe, and they look down and then they see one woman, and what do the boys think about what's normal, and what do the girls think? And so at USAID, we're really focused on trying to use our programming resources, but also our ties within the interagency and the US government and being a member of the NSC to emphasize women's leadership. So we're creating a women's leadership initiative, which is about, there are many, many women leaders in civil society, but the idea of running for office or going into government, that's a whole nother river to cross. And to try to encourage that and inculcate that early, we're doubling our funding of gender-related programming. We thank Canada as a donor, in years where we have some political polarization, you may have heard, in the United States.
Yeah, we did.
So we tend to, come and go in certain respects, and to have large donors like Canada also fill in where we pull back, that's incredibly important because these are programs that otherwise won't continue without that kind of support. So using, again, this opportunity we have with the support of President Biden and Vice President Harris, hopefully with additional resources to bring to bear, knowing that the needs have never been greater in light of coming out of the pandemic, and in light of the fact that even something like climate shocks are in their way sexist. Because who do they affect first? And foremost, they affect women. And so we have to just bear that in mind across our programming, whether it's dedicated formally to women and girls empowerment or to combating gender-based violence or all the sort of dedicated gender-based programming, or whether it's all the programming we do in other sectors that is likely to have a disparate impact on women and girls.
And you brought up the point, you're all in this role that you're trying to sort of cooperate within your governments, across your ministries, across your programming, as you brought up administrative power, but also like with Canada's support of the Inter-American Task Force on Women's Leadership, sort of international cooperation, and really trying to expand that table, that 30% tipping point. We all want parity, but if we can get to 30%, it matters. So representation matters. You all talked about that, and you're all here. I think we want to hear a little bit about maybe some of what were your barriers, and how did you overcome them? Kind of the barriers and opportunities to being a woman, rising up to a ministerial level, rising up to these top levels, being the only one at the table. Why don't we start with you, Minister Jolie?
See, I never thought until I got to, start in working, basically after being at university, that there was a difference between a man and a woman, like fundamentally in terms of your competences. And then being a young lawyer, starting in a big law firm at the time in my hometown of Montreal, it was
Bam!
Bam! It was a shock. And then I think bit by bit, I developed the reflexes of, just working harder, following my intuition, and just affirm myself. Affirm myself, though, but not being against other women. Being very empathetic, bring people along. And then that led me to, I got involved in the community and created many organizations back in my hometown. And then I decided to run to become mayor of Montreal, and I was only 34. I was a baby. And that was another shock, because when I ran and I created a party to do so, and I had to really get on board 100 candidates to be part of my party. It's complicated. In Montreal, a very complicated municipal landscape. Then it was a shock because there was a certain elite that didn't recognize me as a legitimate candidate. And I was snubbed by the media. They didn't want to cover the campaign and all. And then eventually we used social media, we got organized, and I finished very close second. That was another lesson, not only about the importance of, trusting myself, but also trusting the people. Because a lot of times women are, you were referring to, are trusted. They're trusted because, and they embody change. And people are frustrated with the state of things in our democracies. And so they're willing to give a chance to a woman, more than we think. And then eventually so recently we had elections, and we ran again. Prime Minister called election in August, and I was co-chair of the campaign for the country. And I was trying to recruit women. And the stats back in Canada is you need to do 8 phone calls to be able to convince a woman to run. Well, convincing a man usually takes 1 phone call. And the questions were, and good questions. Am I able to continue to have a family? Will I see my children? How about, what's that, how do you deal with it? How do you deal with the psychological pressure? Is it really worth it? Am I good enough? That doubt that was there. And so it was a struggle to recruit, but we got, we increased in numbers of candidates. And then the Prime Minister eventually asked me to be Foreign Minister after we got elected. And I I didn't know if I wanted the job because I've been trying to have a family for some time, and I'm still in that process. And I thought, will I be able to do all these crazy travel? And Erica and I were talking about it a bit earlier, and to be able to be a mom. And Samantha just beforehand was, when she arrived in the room, was saying, "Oh, my daughter just lost her baseball match. I've been following her on, on my app." And so my reaction to the PM, to the Prime Minister Trudeau, was, yes, you know what, I will be able to do that. We can, Felix and I, my spouse and I, are able to do this, but I will need your support. And he said, yes, you go, girl. But so this is it a barrier? Well, it is clearly challenges that I don't think my male colleagues have. But at the same time, we're chartering a new path. And that's also very empowering.
It is empowering, and the allyship piece of it that you mentioned is fantastic. Minister Munoz.
I think there needs to be a lot more honesty about the role of women in leadership positions, whether it's in government or private sector, because there is such an unknown that either you assume that everything is perfect and it's simple, and it's not, or second, it becomes sort of, I think there would be less criticism generally, or in social media attacks, the more that we all open up about what really goes on. And I have an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old. I travel a lot. It is really, really hard. It's really hard every time I go to the airport, and I have lists and lists of things that need to happen, and I'll be in a meeting and my phone is going off. I'm like, the delivery, the avocados were wrong. And it doesn't matter. It happens all the time. There is a crisis that I need to attend, and my children get frustrated. You don't listen to me because I'm not the president, and I have a very angry husband all the time saying, I am not important, and what about me? And he travels also. But having said all that, it is incredibly rewarding. So yes, it's hard, yes, it's difficult, but on the same token, I feel that I am setting an example for my children, for my nieces. Just when we were coming up, Ambassador Powers ran into somebody that said, I came back to politics because I read your book. To me, that's fascinating. That's wonderful to hear those experiences. And so we need to, I think, open up more about what goes on and how difficult it is. I worked at a company where there were only, because it was always only man-led, the women's restroom was essentially the public restroom. So I had to go outside the office in order to use the restroom. That's the kind of dynamic that I've ran through my entire life, and trying to go in offices where it's all men, and that's difficult because when you talk about, I need to step out for a second because I need to, figure out if my son got the present for the birthday party, there is the condescending look, and like, of course you do that. Or I remember once I asked for a raise, and I was told that I wouldn't get it because I had a husband, so it wasn't that necessary. And these are things that happen, and these are things that we need to talk about, because the more that you share your journey, I think that more people might be interested, because at the end, we might criticize a lot and say, well, why are men getting elected? Because women are electing them. We have as much power as they do. So why is it that because we don't support enough women? And so we need to open up. So thank you. Thank you. We need to, first, the women that are there, they need to empower, endorse, support, and open up about their journey and how rewarding it is. But ultimately, there is that fine line of understanding. When you're sitting and you're saying, what can I do? How about you run for office? How about you do it, and we're going to support you.
How about we change it, yeah. Administrator Power, where to begin?
There's that, but I just so love the whole way, Erica, you've described just the importance. It's honesty, but it's also vulnerability, which is the thing that women are taught very early not to show. And so Melanie mentioned that I was on my phone because there's an app that allows you actually to track every inning of the game. You can see where the ball goes. It's crazy to watch my daughter's Little League game, and she's the only girl on her Little League team. I'm very proud of her. She just turned 10. What hadn't happened as we were walking in, but what happened as I was sitting in my chair is that I got a text saying, "Did you forget to arrange Rian's ride home from the game?" And I was like, oh, so if one of you was speaking and I was on my phone, it wasn't because I was doing like affairs of state and, dealing with Ukraine, or it was that I was like, oh, I took care of the ride there and I forgot the ride back. So I just very much appreciate, and I think one of my favorite expressions, I was talking to a group of young people earlier today, a youth forum here, and use the same expression, but it's a great expression, which is never compare your insides to somebody else's outsides. So, because, Mr. Munoz was talking about how she knew she was the best, or not the best, but that she was very capable of being there and being part of it. I think for a whole set of reasons, that start really young, a lot of girls don't feel that way, and they don't feel entitled to the same thing that their boy counterparts and then later their male counterparts are entitled to. So I think that actually, for those who don't always feel on top of their game, or like me in the Situation Room, I'll make my pitch for whatever controversial position I want us to take on something, and then immediately my thought bubble is, I just went on 2 or 3 minutes too long. I had them, and then I just had to make that same point again in just a slightly different way, and I could just feel the papers started to shuffle, and then, but to be honest about that, and so, because there are social sanctions to standing up and to asserting oneself. When I was in the UN Security Council, it's a great laboratory for group dynamics, and in its way, it's a great insight into unconscious bias, because I was, whether I was one of 6 women in the Security Council or whether I was the only woman, that was its own test tube for, again, gender and so forth. But I was always America, as the host country of the UN, as a big donor, as the superpower. So I always said to my other female colleagues at the UN that my Americanness is more salient by and large than my gender in a setting like that, for sure. And yet, I'd make a point, and succinctly even, and then I'd make the point, and then somebody else one of my male colleagues would make a point, but I'd have made the same point, and often better, and then another ambassador would refer back to my Uruguayan colleague, or even my Russian counterpart, or depending on what the issue was. Mm-hmm. And that's so famous in every room, right? The ways in which, and so I love what women have done increasingly in all institutions, in businesses, in schools, and which is, now that we know that this is a phenomenon, to make a point of referring back to female comments and so forth. But I think you asked about barriers. I think that sense that you're alone in feeling those doubts, I think that's a barrier. And so I'm very open and honest, and including in that book, The Education of an Idealist, I decided to just lay it all out there, including, by the way, shuttling from the Situation Room to IVF treatments. Just lay it all out there, lay out my perceptions of failing as a parent as I try to do my job. I think all that's really important. But the other aspect that's a barrier is this unconscious bias. It's that our most progressive counterparts, there's just that still, we just need to chip away at those biases, and that includes naming them, when we encounter them, which is hard to do because again, you don't want to draw attention to yourself. You want to stay focused on the substance. And so how to do that in a way that's consistent with, doing one's job and forging ahead. But I do think the fact that even as the United States, you'd skip over my point to get, it's so ingrained as to, who is valued or what perspectives are valued more. And particularly here in places that don't have the kind of, you asked the first question about gender parity in the cabinet. I mean, I'm so lucky because I work for a leader who's so conscious of that, but in institutions where that's not the case and you don't get that signal from the very top, it must be really, really tough.
Perception matters so much, and part of this representation of all of you at the tables you're at is trying to change that. But as Minister Munoz said, you can't change it until you sort of call it out and have that conversation. We want to end this, as you heard when we talked, it's call to action, right? And we're sort of ending the Summit of the Americas with the call to action. So I want to ask each of you, what's the call to action, either for a country or a multilateral institution, of how can they, as the country and institutions, change and really move towards women's leadership and really moving towards equality and democracy? Minister Munoz?
Accountability, for sure. We need to create instruments and multilateral platforms. We have a lot of women-friendly speeches, but not a lot of action. The more accountability that you create, it's the best way to make sure that the platform is set. But the call to action individually, as I mentioned, is understanding that working in the government or running for office shouldn't feel like this strange and difficult process. And everybody should feel that call and say, hey, I can do it.
Wonderful. Minister Jolie?
I think we need to do 4 things. The first is we need to have more people, more women at the table. So from recruitment at the political level to obviously making sure that we attract good talents to politics, which is a challenge, but I think we have to do that. And even when we're organizing campaigns, we need to have that objective in mind, because there can't be any woman at the table if they're not elected, well, particularly in a parliamentary system. First thing. Second thing is when women are part of the decision-making, it changes the culture. And so we have to continue to change that culture. And yes, there are more women now than at the Summit of the Americas in 1994, but I really hope that in the 2040 Summit of the Americas, there will be even more women than now. So that's the goal. I think the third thing would be also, we have now the tools in Canada to have a gender-based analysis on every single decision we take. And so from really investing in climate change to dealing with the war in Ukraine, we have now that perspective. And we can teach other countries around the world, and this is what we're doing, for example, with Chile right now, about what are the mechanisms we've developed. And the fourth thing I would say is now there's a huge geopolitical shift happening in the world. If I see at the G7, the foreign ministers, we're now, 4 women. It's the first time in history that there are 4 women at the table, and we're dealing with the impacts of a war. And what I saw that was so striking about it was when I was in Poland and meeting with refugees in Rzeszów at the train station, it was mainly women, mainly grandmothers with their children, because their men were fighting in Ukraine. And so we know that sexual violence is used as a tool in this war. We saw it in Bucha. We saw, and we know it's happening right now as we speak, unfortunately. And so we need to continue to to shed light on the issue, to bring accountability. Erica was referring to that. That's what we're doing also at the International Criminal Court. That's what we need to do with working with Ukraine right now to bring much more, investigation capacity. And we send some police officers from the RCMP in Canada to be able to do this investigation. We need to be in proactivity mode. And so I think that these are the 4 things we need to do. And if we do them well, we will see change. And that's our call to action.
Administrator Power.
I'll say 2 things. The first is that I mentioned earlier, and a number of other speakers have spoken about the disparate impact of the pandemic on women. And I mentioned climate change's disparate impact on women. And basically the food crisis that's upon us, disparate impact on women, just across the board. And so, but so too, so we feel it when the crisis comes. We feel it when we're considering the number of shocks to communities and who bears the brunt of that. But so too, to turn that on its head, every program that any of us are part of, whether domestically or if you're lucky and get to be part of the international development opportunities for partnership with countries in the hemisphere and beyond, every program can be a women and girls empowerment program. Every climate program can be that. We're announcing, President Biden's announcing a healthcare worker initiative, or I think has announced here this week, where we're training 500,000 healthcare workers. Again, if we can filter that through this prism of women and girls empowerment, that kind of mainstreaming, and where it's not just our gender programming over here. So just like your point, Minister, about doing gender impact analysis and always actually taking into account what good is this doing for this constituency, so too in thinking about who's at the table in program design, and then who are the beneficiaries, and are we really factoring in the disparate impacts as we seek to blunt the negative impacts, but also, as President Biden would say, build back better. So I think that's point 1, is kind of just mainstreaming this idea. I mean, given, the statistics you started with about all the benefits, we've been citing those statistics, for a long time. And it's why it's, again, not just the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do, and yet, here we are. And so that's just a responsibility I think that we all have to take upon ourselves, is if it can't just be a standalone program initiative over here on women and girls, but if that just can be integrated, that mindset and those benefits can be integrated throughout. And then the second thing, just the last thing, is to quote Vice President Harris, who said last year at something, the status of women is the status of democracy. Mm-hmm. And so on one level, that's, again, if we succeed in empowering women in the ways that we know we should, but don't generally in any country really, that will, of course, strengthen our democracy. But unfortunately, the corollary there is also true, which is that as we see 16 years of democratic recession, and again, someone mentioned this, I think, in their comments, that backsliding almost always is accompanied by spikes in gender-based violence, the deprivation of women's rights, including reproductive rights, as we're seeing in the United States and other places. And so I will end on something, again, just as gender and women and girls empowerment should be part of everything we do, the struggle to strengthen democracy in the world, to reverse these trends, to do as Panama and the Dominican Republic, and Costa Rica are doing in creating an alliance for democracies, for us as Canada and the United States and the G7 and other democracies, to be shoring up not only Ukraine, which is, it's the very strength of that democracy and the growth in fighting corruption and in standing up for human rights that was so threatening to President Putin. But our struggle for the rights of women and girls also can't just happen on its own. We have to see that as linked to the struggle to strengthen democracy. And we're not in a great place. And so when there are countries doing bold things, like the countries I've mentioned in this hemisphere, and Ecuador as well, I think, with a reform agenda, for us to meet them and celebrate that and draw private sector investment to those countries, given the economic challenges that the whole region is facing. If we strengthen democracy, we will strengthen the place for women and girls. If we strengthen the place for women and girls, we will strengthen democracy.
It's a perfect way to end that. And I'd sort of like to capture, all of your comments, and I'll call them the 3 A's, if you will. The first is sort of the accountability, the acknowledgement. Representation matters. Track this, look at this, talk about this. You also talked about analysis, right? Looking at the data, collecting the data, really understanding the impact and the disproportionate impact on women and the intersectionalities, women of color, indigenous women, disabled, and so forth. And then the action, as you talked about, Administrator Powers, so not just linking the programs, but it's the international cooperation and really deciding and committing that women will have a seat at every decision-making table across every issue. And so I'd like to thank all of you for the work you do every day and your expertise, but also for talking with us today about how you do it and how important women's leadership is to democracy.
We're going to set things up for our next event, which is the presentation of the Inter-American Award for Good Practices in Women's Leadership. And while we are just changing the setup on the stage to allow this, I would ask you we're going to present a short video which will last some 3 minutes, and then we'll continue with the program.
The women in my family have long memories. I remember my great-grandmother, who could neither vote nor study, but she taught my grandmother to manage a household. My grandmother worked very hard, double and even triple shifts in the family business, only to get home and continue working there. That is how my mother was able to attend university, where she became the first doctor in our family and in my town. As a woman, she had to overcome many barriers, showing twice as much ability to gain the same level of respect and recognition as a man in her field. I, the 9th granddaughter and an only child, became the mayor of the same town where 4 generations of women have dreamed of being recognized as equals. Almost 100 years separate me from my great-grandmother, and I have the autonomy that she could only imagine. Unlike my grandmother, I was able to choose my profession, and my mother gets excited every time she tells her about the decisions I make. I know very well how lucky I am, and that my situation is not everyone's. For this, I've committed to doing my part to create a more just and equal world. Because although we have made great progress, many women continue to face obstacles in terms of their participation and leadership and power and decision-making. It will take us another 257 years to close the economic gap between men and women, and 95 years to close the same gap in political representation. These are years in which decisions will be made for women by others. Entire generations of women will not have full agency over their lives. That is why we need to accelerate efforts on all parts to foster the participation, empowerment, and greater leadership of women in all areas of power and decision-making. The international organizations announced the launch of the Inter-American Award for Good Practices and Women's Leadership. This award seeks to recognize, highlight, and amplify public policies and private and social initiatives that promote women's leadership from a comprehensive, rights-based approach and from an intersectional perspective so that no woman is left behind. There are 3 award categories. The first, for public policies on the representation of women in decision-making. The second, for private initiatives on women's leadership in business. The third category recognizes initiatives from civil society on the empowerment and leadership of girls and women. With this award, we want to learn more about the initiatives being carried out in our region that promote the women's leadership and highlight those projects that promote our participation and empowerment in order to amplify their reach and promote their replication. With this, we hope to further position the Americas and the Caribbean as the leading region and achievement of SDG 5.5.
Thank you very much, everybody. Muchas gracias por su paciencia. Si puedo invitar que retomamos nuestros asientos, vamos a seguir con el programa. If I could ask everybody to please take your seats again, we're going to continue with the presentation of the Inter-American Award for Good Practices in Leadership. And I would like to invite my good friend, Alicia Todd, who is the Director General for the Parlaméricas, to take the stage to oversee the awarding of these prizes for good practices in women's leadership. And she will be accompanied by Julissa Mantilla Falcon, the President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, who will speak first because then she has to depart for another event, and Alejandra Mora Mora, the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Women, will also participate in this. So I turn the program first to Julissa Mantilla Falcon.
Muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Quiero saludar de manera muy atenta a todas las personas presentes y agradezco profundamente la invitación para dar un mensaje en ocasión de la entrega del Premio Interamericano a las Buenas Prácticas para el Liderazgo de las Mujeres. Desde la Comisión Interamericana, desde la presidencia que tengo a cargo por este año, yo reflexionaba mientras escuchaba a las colegas de la importancia de tener en la Cumbre de las Américas un espacio para hablar sobre los derechos de las mujeres. Y sin embargo también cómo sigue pasando el tiempo y pareciera que a pesar de todos los esfuerzos se siguen repitiendo los mismos problemas y la misma situación de discriminación y de desigualdad. Quería iniciar entonces contándoles cómo desde el Sistema Interamericano de Derechos Humanos, integrado por la Comisión Interamericana y por la Corte Interamericana, es una preocupación fundamental el reconocimiento en el marco del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos del principio de no discriminación. Un principio de no discriminación que implica el reconocimiento de la igualdad, pero no solo de la igualdad formal al nivel normativo, sino también de la igualdad real. Si miramos la historia del sistema interamericano creado por los estados, la Comisión Interamericana tiene más de 60 años. Y el año pasado, por primera vez, tuvo una junta de mujeres. La Corte Interamericana, creado un poco después con el sistema, con la Convención Americana, tiene por primera vez en su historia 3 juezas mujeres. Y esto que es muy importante y que es realmente valioso, también nos debe llevar a pensar las dificultades que tenemos las mujeres para llegar a posiciones de liderazgo. Y hablo de las mujeres en su diversidad. Las mujeres afro, las mujeres indígenas, las mujeres con discapacidad, las mujeres mayores, las mujeres trans, todas las mujeres. Siempre cuando hablamos de este tema, porque además de ser la presidenta, soy relatora para los derechos de las mujeres, recuerdo cómo el sistema interamericano surge en el marco de las dictaduras para investigar los casos de desapariciones forzadas, de tortura, de ejecuciones arbitrarias. Estoy hablando de los años 70. Y sin embargo, el primer caso que reconoce la violencia sexual en el marco de los conflictos armados como una estrategia de guerra o la necesidad de incorporar un enfoque de género, es el caso Castro contra el Perú del año 2006. ¿Qué nos están diciendo los estándares? Que ha habido una demora desde el derecho en reconocer la violencia de género y las afectaciones particulares para las mujeres. Hasta el año pasado yo era relatora para los derechos de las personas mayores. Y en esa relatoría trabajaba con el equipo y decíamos algo que quiero decir ante ustedes. La continuidad de la discriminación y de la violencia contra las mujeres que empieza en la niñez, que sigue durante su juventud y su adultez y que sigue además cuando son mujeres mayores. Hoy, si revisamos la gran mayoría de nuestros códigos penales, ya no se permite, en la gran mayoría, que, por ejemplo, cuando un agresor viole a una mujer, si se casa con ella, ya no va a la cárcel. Eso se modificó. Pero yo me pregunto qué pasa con las mujeres mayores de 70 u 80 años, que vivieron su niñez y juventud con una legislación que no tenía esos avances. Por eso siempre decimos que la mujer mayor de hoy es la niña que nunca pudo denunciar. Que la violencia sexual y además el no permitir que las mujeres decidan sobre su autonomía reproductiva y sobre sus cuerpos ha dado como consecuencia familias que han surgido a raíz de la violencia. Desde la Comisión Interamericana valoramos los esfuerzos que se hacen desde las iniciativas locales, nacionales y estatales. Pero no puedo dejar de iniciar este espacio sin reconocer a cada una de las mujeres y de las niñas que trabajan constantemente para el reconocimiento de sus derechos. Cuando hablamos de otras violaciones de derechos humanos, hay organizaciones de la sociedad civil y eso es muy importante. Pero las mujeres tenemos que demostrar a cada paso que somos igualmente valiosas. Tenemos que justificar nuestras decisiones de libertad sobre nuestra autonomía reproductiva. Tenemos que cumplir roles importantes en la Organización de Estados Americanos, en el sistema interamericano, en la magistratura, y además cumplir roles de madres, y además asumir roles de cuidado de manera casi exclusiva. Por eso, cuando hablamos de igualdad y no discriminación, más allá de las modificaciones normativas, más allá del reconocimiento de los tratados que son importantes, hay que atreverse a apostar por algo establecido en la CEDAW y en la Convención Belén do Pará como obligación máxima de los estados: la transformación social. Cuando escuchamos movimientos feministas donde se habla del derecho a una vida libre de violencia, pareciera que es solo un eslogan. Pero el artículo 3 y el artículo 6 de la Convención de Belén do Pará reconocen este derecho. Y es entonces cuando nos damos cuenta que, a diferencia de otras violaciones de derechos humanos como la desaparición forzada, la ejecución arbitraria, las torturas, que recibieron siempre la mayor atención desde el mismo surgimiento de los tratados, la violencia sexual, la violencia familiar, la violencia obstétrica, la desaparición de mujeres y el feminicidio solo ha sido reconocido después de mucho tiempo y por un esfuerzo constante de las propias mujeres. No hay mujer, y lo digo aquí con toda la tranquilidad, entre comillas, pero también con mucho dolor, no hay mujer que pueda afirmar que ha vivido su vida sin tener algún episodio de violencia de género, de discriminación en el acceso a la carrera oficial de magistratura, de la docencia, de la diplomacia. No hay mujer que pueda decir que ha caminado por la calle sin sufrir acoso sexual. No hay mujer que pueda decir que en algún momento sufrió algún tipo de agresión. Por eso, cuando hablamos de derechos humanos y derechos de las mujeres, no estamos dando solo discursos. Estamos hablando de nuestras propias historias y de nuestros propios dolores. Y para que esto cambie, tiene que haber, en primer lugar, un reconocimiento de la igualdad, como decía, real, pero también de la necesidad enorme de transformación. Como abogada que soy, como jurista, siempre regreso al derecho internacional porque me parece que este es un espacio importante para reflexionar. Cuando nuestras legislaciones, México, Guatemala, Perú, casi todas nuestras legislaciones reconocen el feminicidio y ponen incluso penas muy altas, el feminicidio no disminuye, porque se está poniendo en la ley y en el derecho penal más posibilidades de las que tiene. Cuando se ve el feminicidio solo como muerte de mujeres, estamos desconociendo qué pasa con esos huérfanos y huérfanas del feminicidio. Cuando nos preguntamos cómo podemos hacer para el tema de la seguridad en nuestros países, en nuestros estados, porque la violencia se incrementa, no estamos mirando lo que está pasando con los huérfanos del feminicidio o lo que está pasando con aquellas mujeres que tuvieron que asumir embarazos forzados producto de una violación sexual. Si queremos acabar con esta situación de desigualdad, hay que poner los derechos de las mujeres ahí, donde está, y las mujeres tenemos que estar en esa discusión. La paridad o la cuota no es solamente una herramienta para cumplir con estándares, es una posibilidad de transformar los espacios de tomas de decisión. Una Comisión Interamericana o una Corte Interamericana con más mujeres permite reconocer la violencia obstétrica, esa violencia que han sufrido todas las mujeres cuando dan a luz, como una violación de derechos humanos. Permite decir que aquel magistrado, profesor, embajador, docente, juez, etcétera, que acosa a su practicante o a su estudiante, no es simplemente una cosa cultural o muy graciosa, sino una forma de violencia de género. Durante muchísimo tiempo, las mujeres no pudieron denunciar lo que les pasaba. Y cuando surge el movimiento Me Too o el Yo Te Creo, en Facebook o en redes, y las mujeres empiezan a hablar de manera masiva, se encuentra una respuesta lamentable en la judicialización por querellas por difamación y exigencia de reparaciones a aquellas mujeres que no pudieron denunciar. Parece entonces que el derecho se convierte en una trampa perversa, donde cuando quieres denunciar tu delito no es reconocido, donde cuando quieres ir a hablar te exigen que cuentes y cuentes tu testimonio y que pidas pruebas. Y cuando finalmente te atreves a hacerlo en una red social, eres demandada y tienes que pagar una reparación. ¿Qué es lo que está pasando entonces? ¿Y por qué este tema es tan importante para el sistema interamericano? Porque apostamos por la transformación, porque apostamos por una sociedad de igualdad y de paz. Y no va a haber paz en nuestros países, ni democracias totalmente auténticas, mientras no haya una distribución adecuada de los roles de cuidado, mientras la paridad simplemente sea vista como un número y una estadística y no como una transformación. Y hacia ese proceso los queremos invitar. Para avanzar hacia la igualdad de género y fortalecer la democracia, los Estados deben implementar medidas para remover los obstáculos de discriminación estructural, como yo les venía diciendo. Por eso, la CIDH ha reconocido que la perspectiva de género es una herramienta indispensable para combatir la desigualdad histórica. En este sentido, saludamos la estrategia de transversalización e institucionalización de la perspectiva de género impulsada por la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación y el Consejo de la Judicatura Federal de México, la cual además, al igual que las iniciativas galardonadas con mención especial de Panamá y Colombia, promueve la paridad de género en la conformación del poder estatal. Invitamos a los Estados a replicar estas prácticas, a integrar la perspectiva de género en las políticas públicas. La participación plena e igualitaria de las mujeres en el ámbito público no se limita a su derecho a ocupar cargos públicos en condiciones de igualdad, sino que también comprende la creación de condiciones necesarias para que las prioridades e intereses de las mujeres estén representadas en la agenda pública. Destaco por ello el rol esencial que representan las organizaciones de la sociedad civil. En particular, celebramos los esfuerzos de la Red Construyendo Sororidad de México, la Fundación Hay Mujeres de Chile y la Quinta Ola Perú para impulsar la participación y liderazgo de las mujeres. Asimismo, la CIDH, como les dije, ha advertido una situación de discriminación estructural con roles tradicionales de género y machismo que cruzan a todos los sectores de la sociedad. Por ello, valoramos las estrategias Marca Magenta, Liderazgos para la Igualdad e ILU Women's Fund de la iniciativa privada en el ámbito empresarial, que impulsan el liderazgo y participación de las mujeres en todos los niveles de la organización y promueven su acceso a oportunidades laborales, al tiempo que implementan medidas digitales. La pandemia, además, nos confrontó con la realidad de la desigualdad y violencia de género. Por eso nosotros llamamos en nuestra resolución 120 a los Estados a asegurar la participación de las mujeres, una participación que además tiene que permitirnos visibilizar cómo, si bien la pandemia no podía preverse, lo que sí podía preverse era que la violencia sexual y la violencia familiar iba a continuar. En este sentido, queremos destacar el liderazgo de la doctora Tracy Bowell de Guyana y la señora Teresa Faraluque del Ecuador en su labor al frente de la emergencia sanitaria derivada por la pandemia COVID-19. Como presidenta de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, además de instar a los Estados a replicar las buenas prácticas y los aprendizajes, yo quisiera mandar un mensaje en esta Cumbre de las Américas. a unirnos y a seguir adelante ante los retrocesos que estamos afrontando. Como presidente y relatora para las mujeres, y con el equipo de la comisión que aquí me acompaña, nos comprometemos a seguir trabajando y a luchando por el cambio. Pero necesitamos de los estados, de las instituciones de derechos humanos, de la magistratura y también de ustedes, mujeres, de todas las partes, de todas las diversidades. No están solas, estamos con ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Good evening. I'm just going to jump right in. First, I am very grateful to be here on behalf of Parlaméricas, and I can assure you that Parlaméricas is honored to participate in the Inter-American Task Force for Women's Leadership, and that the parliaments from across the Americas and the Caribbean are committed to work through Parlaméricas to advancing gender equality. But we've been here for hearing about gender equality, and I think now it's time to turn to honor our awardees this evening. And so it's my great honor to take advantage of this important opportunity in the framework of the 9th Summit of the Americas to recognize and celebrate progress in women's leadership through the Inter-American Award for Good Practices in Women's Leadership. This award is a collective initiative of some of the member institutions of the Inter-American Task Force on Women's Leadership with the support of the Government of Canada. It was launched in March 2021 in the framework of the CSW 65 and seeks to recognize, highlight, and amplify public policies as well as initiatives from the private sector and civil society that promote and increase the number of women in leadership positions and/or strengthen their empowerment and advocacy capacity in decision-making. A total of 110 experiences and 28 women leaders were nominated during this edition, representing 18 countries. We received a wide diversity of experiences from different levels of public administration, from the private sector, and from civil society. It's important to emphasize that all these experiences are important, and all have made significant contributions to promote women's leadership. Today, we are going to award the experiences selected by the Advisory Committee, and I'm honored to announce the winners. Among the finalists, the Advisory Committee decided to award some honorable mentions in each category, and we are going to start with these. In the category Public Policies and Guarantees for the Exercise of Women's Leadership, the Advisory Committee determines to grant with an honorable mention to the Ministry of Social Development, Panama, for the Experience Gender Parity Initiative, which is a public-private alliance aimed at increasing women's participation in the labor market, reducing the gender wage gap, and promoting women's participation in leadership positions. This experience also highlights the constitution of a National Council for Gender Parity. The District Secretariat for Women Mayors of Bogota has likewise receiving an honorable mention for experiences Bogota 50-50, route for gender parity in the open government of Bogota, highlighting the strategies implemented to promote and strengthen parity in citizen participation bodies, the promotion of women's caucuses in local administrative boards, the implementation of political training actions, and the creation of a multi-party district gender table. They are not here today, but we want to send them our recognition from Los Angeles to Panama and Colombia. I ask you to help me congratulate these two honorable mentions. The winner of the award in this category is to the Supreme Court of Justice of the Nation and Federal Judiciary Council of the Judicial Power of the Federation of Mexico for the experience Strategy for Mainstreaming and Institutionalization of the Gender Perspective, highlighting the actions carried out from a comprehensive approach aimed at achieving equal integration in the federal justice sector, transforming the institutional culture and judging and defending with an intersectional gender perspective. The leadership of the officials of the judicial branch of the Federation in all stages of the process is highlighted in this initiative. The President of the Supreme Court of Justice of Mexico, Arturo Zaldivar, receives this recognition, and I invite him to join us here to say a few words. Mr. Zaldivar.
Permítame, señor magistrado, hacer el reconocimiento del Premio Interamericano a las buenas prácticas para el liderazgo de las mujeres, a la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación y al Consejo de Judicatura Federal del Poder Judicial de la Federación. Gracias por esa contribución.
A nombre de la delegación mexicana hablará la magistrada Fabiana Estrada.
Muy buenas tardes. Hace 3 años nos propusimos cambiar el Poder Judicial de la Federación para hacerlo más igualitario, más incluyente y menos discriminatorio en contra de las mujeres, y lo estamos logrando. Cambios como cambios de esta trascendencia, requieren de personas comprometidas en posiciones de poder. Y por eso son importantes los liderazgos de mujeres, pero por eso son fundamentales los aliados. El ministro presidente, Arturo Saldívar, presidente de la Corte Mexicana, tuvo una visión y una convicción profunda y depositó en un grupo de mujeres y hombres, pero mayoritariamente mujeres, la confianza y la responsabilidad de llevar a cabo esta tarea. Este premio que hoy nos honra es testimonio y es ejemplo de que los cambios profundos, las transformaciones reales son posibles en las instituciones y en las sociedades, con trabajo, con dedicación, con compromiso, con entrega, en paridad y con trabajo en equipo. Muchas gracias.
In the category Private Initiatives on Women's Leadership in Business, the Advisory Committee agreed to grant with an honorable mention to Deatkin Asset Management, Inc., Deatkin Impact, in collaboration with Pro Mujer International, Canada, for the Experience You Women's Empowerment Fund, which, with an emphasis on economic empowerment and entrepreneurship for women, invests in a diversified portfolio of high-impact companies that promote women in leadership and governance, products and services that meet the needs of women and girls, value chains with a gender perspective, and labor equity. Please send them an applause and congratulations. And the winner of the award in this category is the Banco Fomento a Iniciativas Económicas, Banco FEE SA, Bolivia, for the experience Marca Magenta Leadership for Equality, an initiative that stands out for its commitment to promoting inclusive leadership and women's participation at all levels of the organization, through training programs, both to strengthen the leadership skills of women workers, as well as new masculinities for men workers. The initiative also establishes a policy of diversity and gender equality, a policy of prevention, attention, and resolution of cases of workplace sexual harassment, and an institutional guide on communication from a gender perspective, in addition to actions aimed at promoting the empowerment, economic, technological, and social of women and access to job opportunities. Ms. Claudia San Martin and Ms. Monica Lopez, managers of the bank, receive this recognition here today, and I invite them to join us up here to say a few words. Ms. San Martin, Ms. Lopez.
que jugar con los tacones, Miss Martín. Realmente es un honor entregarle a usted en representación del Banco de Fomento de Iniciativas Económicas el premio por haber sido seleccionada la marca Magenta en el tema Liderazgos para la Igualdad en la categoría Iniciativas Privadas para el Liderazgo de las Mujeres en el ámbito empresarial. Muchas gracias por esta contribución a la sociedad. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a los y las representantes de las instituciones que respaldan este reconocimiento, a las autoridades y también a todo este maravilloso público presente. A nombre de Banco FIE, una de las entidades financieras más grandes en Bolivia, con presencia tanto urbana como rural, expresamos nuestro mayor agradecimiento al haber sido honrados con este premio por este modelo de gestión, marca Magenta, construyendo liderazgos para la igualdad. Recibimos este reconocimiento como un aliciente a nuestro trabajo que refleja el compromiso con la igualdad de género y el empoderamiento integral de las mujeres que está presente desde nuestros orígenes hace 37 años y que hoy adquiere aún más relevancia. La diversidad o temas como la diversidad, la igualdad de género, el feminismo han sido abordados desde los estados, los gobiernos, por organizaciones civiles, pero hoy es un tema o son temas que deben estar en la agenda de la empresa privada. En un tiempo que parece profundizar la desigualdad y la violencia, en Banco FIE trabajamos activamente buscando ser un referente empresarial que evidencie que la igualdad y el liderazgo de mujeres en todos los niveles de la organización son catalizadores de desarrollo y de crecimiento sostenible. Muchas gracias.
In the category Initiatives of Civil Society for the Empowerment and Leadership of Girls and Women, the Advisory Committee agreed to grant an honorable mention to Hay Mujeres Fundación, Chile, for the comprehensive model for women's leadership experience, which highlights its commitment to the promotion, visibility, abilities, and leadership of expert women in all areas of knowledge, through training and the articulation of networks and alliances between experts, public sector actors, media companies, also involving leading men as ambassadors. They also agreed to grant a second honorable mention to Quinta Ola, Feminist Association of Peru, for the Girl Gov Peru experience, a program aimed at comprehensively strengthening the political empowerment and leadership capacities of diverse adolescent women in Peru. Through workshops, planning social change initiatives, and intergenerational mentoring, they work to strengthen the capacities of adolescents for public advocacy, making their agendas on the rights of children and adolescents visible on key issues such as education and menstrual hygiene and street sexual harassment, among others. And the winner of, well, before we get to the winner, let's congratulate our two honorable mentions. And the winner of the award in this category is to the Building Sisterhood Network in Mexico for the Building Sisterhood Experience, a project that was brought about by the initiative of an alliance of people and groups that join forces to promote the political participation of Indigenous women from the Huixarica community located in the northern area of the state of Jalisco. The initiative stands out for its close work with community leaders and the formation of working groups, training in gender perspectives, and development of skills for political participation, both face-to-face and digital in the native language, as well as meeting and dialogue spaces that, among other things, gave rise to the scope of a political agenda for Indigenous women of the state of Guadalajara. The experience has already begun to be replicated in other regions of the state. Ms. Fatima Gonzalez, Marisa Lopez, and Rosa Maria Castillero received this recognition, and I invite them to join me up here to say a few words.
Bueno, es un honor realmente entregar este premio por haber sido seleccionada en la experiencia Construyendo Sororidad, palabra mágica para las mujeres en la categoría Iniciativas de la Sociedad Civil para el Empoderamiento y Liderazgo de las Niñas y Mujeres. Se lo hago entrega a la que está aquí en el centro, con un abrazo y un reconocimiento. Bien, por favor, tomen la palabra.
Que ako United Neneutiteva Kayerima Ukabi Rarica. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Marisa López Martínez del pueblo Huirrárica de México. Colaboro con la red Construyendo Sororidad, quienes hoy recibimos con orgullo este premio. Desde esta red tejemos alianzas entre mujeres indígenas y no indígenas. Deconstruimos nuestras diferencias integrándonos desde miradas diversas, caminando juntas hacia el encuentro de nuestros corazones. Agradecemos el presente reconocimiento porque nos permite visibilizar la lucha de las mujeres indígenas de México ante el mundo. Nos gustaría que este momento hiciera eco en los corazones de mis hermanas indígenas y que instancias y naciones aquí presentes abrieran estructuralmente el camino para facilitar la presencia de nuestras voces, el respeto a nuestras reflexiones e impulso a nuestras estrategias. Compañeras, habitemos los espacios de poder desde lo cotidiano, lo comunitario e institucional. Florezcamos a partir de nuestras propias voces y sigamos bordando nuestra propia historia. ¡Vivan las mujeres indígenas! ¡Pamparios!
Finally, in this initiative, we wanted to recognize women's leadership in the response to the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Having received relevant nominations from women at the forefront of the response by the states, humanitarian aid, medical assistance, as well as community leaders, each and every one with a fundamental role in different areas of intervention. The decision of the advisory committee was very difficult, but they agreed to grant a special recognition to Dr. Tracy Bovell from Guyana, president of the COVID-19 task force of the Georgetown Public Hospitals Corporation, for her work on the front lines of the health emergency caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, from where she led the development of protocols and policies, as well as training aimed at health workers at all levels in the country. She also assumed the mandate of being the doctor in charge of the National Hospital for Infectious Diseases when the need arose to increase capacity to attend to then rebound in COVID-19 cases. Through Dr. Bovell, this recognition aims to highlight, distinguish, and thank all the women of health professionals who were on the front line of care during the health emergency. Unfortunately, Dr. Bovell was held up and didn't quite make it here to Los Angeles with us. So I would like to invite Dilys McDonald of SUWIL, Caribbean Women in Leadership, who has agreed to receive her award on her behalf, because we have an award here for her, and so we can applaud Dr. Bovell in this initiative. Thank you, Dilys, for receiving this on behalf of Dr. Bovell. Thank you very much. We also have a special acknowledgement to Mrs. Teresa Farah Luque, President of the Provincial Board of Guayas of the Red Cross of Ecuador. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she led the human team of collaborators for the management of humanitarian aid, which included medical brigades, conducting COVID-19 tests, among other actions. Highlighting the importance of such work is one of the areas most affected by the health emergency in their country. And I invite her to join us here today to say a few words. Por favor, Teresa Esfaral Luque.
Bueno, un honor, Teresa Fara, entregarle el premio a las mujeres lideresas en la respuesta a la crisis. Es el Premio Interamericano a las Buenas Prácticas, liderando la ayuda humanitaria en Ecuador. Un abrazo. Gracias.
Yo solo soy la figura visible del esfuerzo que alcanzó este honor. Por eso, en este prestigioso foro, quiero compartirlo con todo mi equipo de apoyo, esos rostros ocultos de voluntarios y personal humanitario que hicieron posible enfrentar con éxito esta crisis COVID. Mi gratitud se extiende a la vida misma por brindarme la oportunidad de ayudar, porque cuando se sirve, no gana quien recibe, gana quien da. Debo confesar que la gratitud es el sentimiento que me acompaña desde que se me otorgó esta distinción. Y hoy quiero expresársela también a la OEA por volver su mirada en esta crisis global hacia la labor dedicada y silenciosa de las mujeres de América, quienes cada día desde sus respectivos roles luchan por hacer de este un mundo más justo, más humano. Y finalmente he de dedicar esta designación a mis hijos. Gracias.
And that brings us to a conclusion of our award ceremony. Please join me again in congratulating all of our awardees and special recognizees. And again, as a member of the Inter-American Task Force for Women Empowerment, I would like to thank the Government of Canada for your support for the task force, for your support for gender equality, for your support for this award ceremony, and I'm sure to be an excellent reception to follow for continued networking. And I'd like to thank you for your support for Américas. Thank you so much for allowing us to be here. I pass it back to you, Jamie, to close us out.
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And before we finish off and gather for our networking reception, I would like to invite Maria Celina Conte, Director of the Summit Secretariat, to give some final reflections on the project that she's implementing on improving the participation of women's organizations in the Summits of the Americas process. So please come up on the stage, Maria Celina. She will be joined subsequently by Terry Ince, who can speak about her own experience in Trinidad and Tobago in advancing the UN Convention on all forms of discrimination against women. But before I give up the mic for the final time this evening, and beyond thanking again the Canadian government, I personally wanted to take this opportunity to thank Maria Celina. She is as strong a woman leader as we have in the OAS. She has done an incredible amount over the last 5 years as the director of the Summit Secretariat to improve the process of the Summits of the Americas, and most importantly, opening it up to the voices of the affected and vulnerable populations of the Americas. So it's important when you realize that even while she has been a constant presence in the development of this civil society process. She's also been tirelessly working with the U.S. to host the negotiations of 5 political commitments that will be delivered at the summit, as well as leading the summit secretariat to ever higher performance. The successful closure of these negotiations on Monday against a background of ideological bickering and political posturing was nothing short of heroic. So I have to say I'm amazed on a daily basis by the women that I work with at the OAS, and would not feel good closing out this ceremony without saying that specifically and thanking Maria Selena for everything that she has done.
Muchísimas gracias. Realmente es un honor y este reconocimiento no lo esperaba. Realmente uno hace las cosas por la responsabilidad que conlleva, pero pues siempre es bienvenido uno de estos reconocimientos porque creo que son también una motivación para todas nosotras. Lo que quisiera es un poco compartirles el trabajo que hemos venido llevando a cabo con el apoyo del Gobierno de Canadá, justamente, y con la participación de organizaciones de mujeres, con la finalidad de poder fortalecer la participación de organizaciones de la sociedad civil, en particular la participación de organizaciones de mujeres en el proceso de cumbres. Esto no hubiera sido posible sin ese apoyo, sin la colaboración también de la Comisión Interamericana de Mujeres, del Task Force, porque todos tenemos la misma visión, el mismo objetivo. Queremos institucionalizar la participación de ustedes, de las organizaciones de mujeres en el proceso de cumbres. Una participación que no solamente empiece ahora con este inicio o en este marco del proceso de preparación de la cumbre que ya está acabando, sino sobre todo en el proceso de seguimiento y de acá en adelante, a fin de que sus voces, sus perspectivas estén permanentemente reflejadas, no solamente en los documentos que se trabajen, en las discusiones, sino que en toda la labor que lleva a cabo la Secretaría de Cumbres, lo cual definitivamente puede tener un impacto en cadena, ya que trabajamos con todos los actores, desde gobiernos, organismos internacionales y regionales, con todas las organizaciones de la sociedad civil y una serie de actores sociales, incluyendo el sector privado, incluyendo las juventudes, incluyendo las organizaciones de mujeres. Y yo quisiera destacar que como parte de los outcomes o resultados tal vez más saltantes que este proyecto que se viene llevando a cabo con el apoyo de Canadá y la participación de una serie de organizaciones de mujeres representativas, básicamente lo han podido ir viendo en el transcurso de estas semanas. Estas semanas se han podido dar cuenta que las organizaciones de mujeres han venido participando en una serie de actividades en el marco del proceso de cumbre. Se ha elevado la visibilidad de la necesidad de avanzar en un enfoque de género, de derechos y la igualdad sustantiva, especialmente en el proceso de implementación que conllevará los resultados de esta cumbre. Y como parte de esos elementos se han dado, o digamos resultados, podemos ver una declaración que el día de hoy justamente nos han hecho llegar las organizaciones de mujeres, una declaración que significa el inicio, la semilla para el establecimiento, así es, el establecimiento de un movimiento, una declaración fundacional de este movimiento, organización Somos Lideresas. Asimismo, el día de ayer pudimos ver en la inauguración por parte del presidente Blinken de esta cumbre el reconocimiento también a esta necesidad de avanzar con los derechos de las mujeres y la igualdad de género al tener entre las personas que pudieron honrar esta apertura a nuestra querida Terry, a nuestra querida Terry. Creo que esa es una oportunidad inigualable el haber podido tener a la señora Terry Inns en la apertura del día de ayer. Y así hay una infinidad de elementos que yo podría seguir enumerando. Sin embargo, Simplemente quisiera en este momento dejarles justamente con las palabras de Terry Ings, a fin de que nos siga llenando de esa vitalidad, de esa motivación que nos hace muy bien realmente. Y además quisiera destacar también las palabras que nos han llegado al alma, las palabras de Yulisa Mantilla, la presidenta de la Comisión Interamericana de Mujeres y mi compatriota, así es, de Derechos Humanos, perdón, que nos han llegado al alma porque has logrado realmente describir esa situación que viven millones y millones de mujeres y todo lo que está pendiente aún por hacer. Por supuesto, Alejandra Mora, tú eres nuestro referente también en el proceso de Cumbres, así que también muchísimas gracias. Terry, por favor, adelante.
Good afternoon. What a week we've had, right? It's been great. I have to admit, this is my first summit. What a way to be at your first summit. Wow. I don't think I can live this down, and we've set a very high bar. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, I've made so many friends since I've been here this week, since I arrived on Sunday. It is my honor to bring closing remarks of this timely event. This event, which is Women in Leadership, Advancing Women and Gender Equality and Democracy in the Americas, and it's all thanks to the OAS, the Summit Secretariat, and of course, the government of Canada. I almost said Trinidad and Tobago. All right. So if you heard, my name is Terry Ince. I'm the founding director of the CEDAW Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, and we are committed to the sustainable implementation of the mandates of the convention, but we also are grounded in the three principles of non-discrimination, substantive equality, and state accountability. But I am very privileged to represent women's organizations in the Americas and Trinidad and Tobago here today. Gender equality and democracy are quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, under attack. And citizens must hear the call. We must hear the call to action and to defend. For decades, women's organizations have been working diligently, some paying the ultimate price to ensure women and girls have an opportunity for development, empowerment, and leadership. Adolescents and young women are taking leadership roles on issues of environment, healthcare, including sexual, reproductive, and mental health, and politics. And today, 74 years since the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations, we remain resolute in our demands for resources which are required to ensure women's rights are secured through advocacy programs and policies, and respect for us and our contributions in all of our diversity toward building a more equitable and balanced society. For over a year now, myself and many of the women who are here and others across the hemisphere have engaged in national and regional consultations in preparation for this historic 9th Summit of the Americas. And I have to say personally that I have not been disappointed. I'm sure my sisters in the audience will agree with me that they have not been as well. So we are here representing civil society women's organizations to engage. We've done that. We've contributed. We've negotiated. We've learned from each other. And we're encouraging each other, but we're also encouraging governments to do a few things, to work with us, to recognize the legal and binding obligations of treaties that are already in place and other agreements, to leverage a gender-responsive recovery approach. I've said this before, to rebuilding, which includes meaningful engagements by women's organizations. It's been proven You cannot do it alone. You bring women along with you to do these things. And women have been doing it on the ground all along. So recognize that and include women in rebuilding. And to close the outstanding wage gaps and address existing structural barriers that continue in formal sectors while addressing the informal sector, overwhelmingly filled by women who work oftentimes without social safety mechanisms such as health insurance or paid leave, rendering them vulnerable to any change in the economy. And finally, let's emerge from this 9th summit, recommitting to the leadership and participation of women and the representation of the women's agenda, which is currently underrepresented. We've heard the numbers before. So we have achieved a lot, and we readily admit that. We've achieved a lot in advancing women's leadership and in promoting women's rights in recent years, but there is much more to be done. This is one of the lessons of the pandemic, I believe. However, by honoring commitments made and by attaining goals set, we can bring about more equitable societies that are better equipped to meet the challenges of the post-pandemic era. Because our adolescent girls and young women must see themselves as part of the process of rebuilding. And like they say, nothing about us without us. It is a movement, and we need to pay attention to that, to do our utmost to be inclusive and transformative. Because every citizen, every one of us and every one of us in our countries has a significant role to play in the development issues that must be addressed in the months and years ahead. Governmental agencies working with civil society will be a focal point in the realization of more equitable societies. So let us start today. Let's press the reset button. We'll start today, striding forward positively on that journey together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. Ya estamos llegando al final del evento. No quisiera terminar sin también dar las gracias en nombre de toda la Secretaría de Cumbres de las Américas. Realmente nos sentimos muy honrados de poderlos tener aquí. Las gracias eternas al Gobierno de Canadá por realmente fomentar este tipo de no solo eventos, todos los esfuerzos que en este momento se están llevando a cabo por parte de la Secretaría de Cumbres y también de otras instancias para justamente fomentar la igualdad de género y temas en materia de derechos humanos de las mujeres en la agenda hemisférica. Eventos como este nos hace reflexionar sobre la necesidad vital de considerar a las mujeres en las esferas de decisión en todos los ámbitos y niveles para lograr avanzar en esa igualdad sustantiva, en esa igualdad real y de hecho de manera tal de fortalecer así las democracias, los sistemas democráticos. Hemos conocido las trayectorias de lideresas de la región que se han destacado en diversas áreas. Sus experiencias y sus trayectorias nos renuevan el impulso para seguir promoviendo con mayor fuerza el liderazgo de más mujeres. Porque lograr que más mujeres se involucren en la agenda política de sus países es un objetivo de la democracia y un instrumento político que permite a mujeres y hombres compartir en igualdad el poder y las decisiones. Porque el liderazgo de las mujeres en todos los niveles es el camino para la consolidación de la democracia desde las bases de la sociedad. Este gran evento ha sido posible, como lo mencioné, al apoyo del Gobierno de Canadá, pero también a la participación de todas estas mujeres, líderes que ya lo son, estas mujeres que vienen trabajando en la agenda derechos humanos de las mujeres y la igualdad de género. Es un evento que reconoce también los esfuerzos desde distintos ámbitos, sectores, a los trabajos que sirven como un referente para otros. Este encuentro igualmente nos ha permitido, y es uno de los productos, diría yo, también llevados a cabo en coordinación con el Task Force Interamericano y con la Comisión Interamericana de Mujeres, con quienes siempre quedamos a disposición para justamente avanzar estas temáticas dentro de la agenda hemisférica en el marco del proceso de cumbres. Estamos muy seguras que estas iniciativas, que estos esfuerzos que se han llevado a cabo en esta cumbre por primera vez, yo diría, desde distintos ámbitos, involucrando a las organizaciones de mujeres, involucrando esfuerzos que reconocen trayectorias en dicha dirección, consideramos que van a perdurar, pueden perdurar. Tenemos que trabajar para poder consolidarlas y para poder institucionalizar acciones como estas dentro del proceso. Hemos sembrado la semilla y esperamos poder seguir trabajando de esta manera en las futuras cumbres. Como mencionaba la doctora Etienne, we don't have time to lose. Así es que esperemos que todas esas presentaciones, esas palabras, esas trayectorias nos sirvan también a todos de impulso. Yo lo que quisiera es pedirme un poquito, saliendo del esquema, que aquellas organizaciones, representantes de organizaciones de mujeres puedan ponerse de pie a fin de poderles hacer un reconocimiento a ese esfuerzo. Así que les invito. Muchísimas gracias, sigan contando con nosotros, tienen muchos aliados en estos esfuerzos, nada se puede sola, todos con todos y todas. Con esto damos por concluida esta importante sesión y les invitamos a la recepción en honor de las lideresas premiadas y a reunirnos con las representantes de las organizaciones de mujeres y organizaciones también del sistema interamericano, líderes en estos ámbitos. Muchas gracias.